Now let's turn our attention toward preparing to create a virtual machine. Now, when you actually create a virtual machine, VMware Workstation is going to present you with quite a few options. Now, you'll see a lot of these same options if you're using the VMware Player, the totally free version, but still, you don't want to do what most people do, which is a knee-jerk reaction of just simply going out there, opening up Workstation, kicking off, to create a new machine, and boom, kicking off the wizard, and then just start wildly answering questions. Because as you can see, some of the options that you have here, and then there's a lot of other ones out there as well, we'll get to those later, you're going to be asked a lot of things about the environment you're creating, and so you need to consider these things before you actually build the machine. You can save yourself a lot of frustration, heartache, and time. And so let's talk about some of these things. Now, by the way, VMware in their documentation provides a checklist for you to actually fill out before you create a virtual machine, and I'll make sure that you have a copy of that in your work files folder, save you a little trouble from having to go chase that down. But if you really like using those things and making those kind of preparations beforehand, feel free to use that. Now, after you do a few of these, you'll kind of start to think this way, but understand they're going to throw a few things at you. I'm just going to list them here, and then I'm going to talk about some of these more specifically in separate videos. First of all, when you kick off that wizard to create a new virtual machine, you're going to tell it whether you want to do a typical or a custom configuration. Now, typical, it's going to make some assumptions for you, set some defaults, and with a custom configuration, you can go a little deeper and get a few more options. Now, one of the options you'll get in the custom configuration is something called a hardware compatibility setting, and this is where you can actually tell it to behave under different hardware settings to see what different virtual machines are going to do, for example, running on different versions of Workstation. Then you're going to be asked, okay, what guest operating system are you going to install into this virtual machine? And it's going to make some decisions for you there, and so obviously you need to know what guest operating system you need to install. This is one of the easiest answers. You already know that, or you probably wouldn't be creating a virtual machine. Now, this is probably the most deceptive one right here, and that is you need to provide the name of the virtual machine and the file location. Now, the name's the particularly tricky one because the first one's easy, right? Windows 7. The second Windows 7 machine, though, starts to become a little more challenging. What are you going to call it? Windows 7 2? Windows 7B? Well, before long, you've got Windows 7 2, Windows 7 3, Windows 7 4, Windows 7 5, and you come back later to start one up, and you can't remember which one you need to start. So you need to come up with some sort of naming convention so that you name your machines what their functionality is, the reason you have them, something that tells you which one you need to get to do certain functions. Then, of course, the file location. And we will talk about file location in a separate video because you do have some options here, and we'll talk about those a little bit later on in a separate video. You can go look for that video. It's going to be called Understanding Virtual Disk Options. Now, you also can choose the number of processors for your virtual machine. This is going to depend on a lot of things. How many logical processors the Workstation software sees available from your host system. And you'll want to set the number of processors based on the amount of processing power you think your virtual machine is going to need. Two things are going to help you here. Number one, the number of processors, logical processors available that Workstation sees, and then just plain old experience to know how it's going to run in a virtual environment. Next is allocation of memory. This is another one that's usually pretty simple. Give it as much memory as you possibly can without cannibalizing the host operating system, but there are some things about memory that can get really kind of slippery for you, and so for that reason, I'm going to do a separate video on memory. That one will be called Understanding Memory Options, so look for that one out there. But just understand you need to have some idea of how much memory you're going to assign to each virtual machine, because you also need to decide early on how many virtual machines will be running at once, how much total host operating system memory do I need. We'll talk more about that later. You also will be presented the opportunity to choose your network connection type. How is this virtual machine going to talk to other machines on the network, and how far do we want that network reach to be? We can set them up as like local, and they can only communicate with each other in a virtual environment, so only virtual machines on the host can talk to each other. We can set it up as a bridge, and the virtual machine will get its own IP address if that's possible from a DHCP server, and then we can set it up as basically a NAT, where it'll share the IP address with the host, but use network address translation to communicate. Then if you do custom configuration, you can choose the I/O controller type, and then you get to select exactly a hard disk configuration. And again, this is in custom configuration. You can select the type of hard disk, IDE, SCSI, that sort of thing. You can select hard disk modes. You can choose a physical disk or an unused partition. Again, there's a few gotchas, some things you need to know here. So look for those videos. Probably be a two-parter out there, understanding virtual disk options. It's probably going to be a two-parter because I keep coming across, oh yeah, I need to tell them about this too and this too. So look for a two-parter out there. Then you're going to need to specify the size of your disk or the disk capacity. Again, sounds like a simple question. There's a lot going on here. I'll do a separate video on whether to do a single or the optional multiple 2 GB files. By default, it's going to tell you to do a single file, one big VMDK file, but you can also do the multiples, which is better. We'll talk about that separate video. So you need to think these things through. Have this ready. Don't just go out there willy-nilly and start creating virtual machines. Willy-nilly, Southern technical term. That means you don't really know what you're going to do. You're just kind of choosing it on the fly. So anyway, lots to do. And so we're going to step through some of these things and talk about some of these options in detail.